The second session of the DIMES conference. So we are going to be talking about the role of Europe in the world. So it's a very broad scheme. I'll be your moderator for this session. My name is Frank Mattheis. I work for the United Nations University, particularly for its Institute for Comparative Regional Integration Studies, and we're based in Belgium. To give a bit of background, we're part of the UN system, but it's unlike the name suggests. It's not really a UN university. It's more of a network of research centers across the world, and ours focuses on regional integration particularly. I'll have the pleasure to interact with Elisabet Dahlberg Frisk, who is posted here in Pretoria at the EU Delegation to South Africa. Since 2020, so you've been here a while. She has a trajectory of diplomacy in national and multilateral organizations in the UN, particularly, but also in the Swedish Foreign Service of which she's a national. Initially, we were supposed to be three here with the Turkish ambassador, who you'll probably understand why she couldn't come. Obviously, her country is going through a great deal of suffering right now, so she'll be excused. So we might stop a little bit earlier if we run out of time, which is then again fine, because the reception, I've been told, is not outside here, but we'll have to cross the pedestrian bridge to get back to main campus and to find the reception, which is a reception to which everyone is warmly invited, including people online. If you are in Pretoria, you still can make it for the reception. So we'll have Emily that's gonna bring us over the pedestrian bridge, so we'll need to walk a little bit before getting there. So we'll have to do without the Turkish ambassador, but just to acknowledge that we're very privileged to have colleagues from Turkey here. So that's much appreciated during those very testing times. So I'd without much further ado. So the role of Europe in the world that we were given as a title. So it's very broad and abstract and sort of as a scene setter to get into the practicalities. But how does it actually work to sort of to give us an idea? The EU is through you in a way and through your team engaging with the world and with South Africa and Africa in particularly to give us an idea of the main activities you're being involved and initiatives that you see are getting traction.
No, thank you very much. And can you hear me? Yeah, and thank you so much for the invite. Our ambassador would have loved to be here, but unfortunately had other engagements. So yes, I work here at the European Union Delegation to South Africa. That is something that I often have to explain both here and at home, why there is an EU office in South Africa. And as with everything in the EU, it goes back to a treaty. And the treaty on the European Union notes that in its relations with the wider world, it shall uphold and promote its values and interests, like any sort of bilateral diplomatic objective would state, and contribute to the protection of its citizens. But it further notes that we shall contribute to peace and security, sustainable development of the earth, solidarity and mutual respect among peoples, free and fair trade, eradication of poverty, and the protection of human rights, as well as the strict observance and the development of international law, and respect for the principles of the United Nations Charter. So as such, our role as a sort of diplomatic mission is always going to be very values driven. So in all the work we do, we will go back to these sort of values and principles. But then I guess something that sets us apart a bit is also that it has to be consensus-based, that we represent 27 member states, and that can both be a challenge at times, but I think it's also a source of strength, and we see that when we manage to agree on whatever foreign policy matter, it gives us a great deal of weight and strength, and we've seen that. Not least now after the Russian illegal and unprovoked, unjustified invasion of Ukraine, where bureaucracy that sometimes moves quite slowly, all of a sudden, with the determination of all 27 member states, was able to move very swiftly. But also in terms of pushing for norms and standards that will support the lives of citizens, taking on tech giants, etc., is much easier with the strength of all those 27. So in terms of our role in the world, we put a great deal of emphasis on our relations with the broader world. So even if the EU, of course, at the center is about the citizens of the European Union and the collaboration within the Union, we also recognize that we are part of the world, and we want to play a positive role as a major player.
Thank you for this. On the further you get away from Europe, the more sort of Europe becomes one, or is seen as one, also from other countries, so that the EU morphs sort of into being the continent as well. How do you experience this here in your daily life? That maybe you're somehow perceived as also sort of the spokesperson of a continent that also includes members for which you don't have a mandate to represent. So how does sort of coordination work, but at the same time making sure that you have sort of your own objectives and your own identity as the EU, which is then more specific than Europe?
No, very good question. I think for most of us, it's first when we sort of travel or leave our country that we really experience our culture, but also get to sort of experience how we're being viewed and perceived. And so I would say, as a Swedish person, it was probably first when I left Europe that I felt truly European, and that it was easier to sort of identify with the ideals of the European Union, and seeing that I'm part of that as a Swedish person. But I think you're very right. Here we're quite far away from the European Union. It's a quite complex animal to understand, even for those of us who are in it. And yes, we often, sometimes it's sort of used, we say Europe or European Union, and we're not really sure what we mean. So that is a struggle, and I think, to be very honest, I think we have a great deal of awareness that the awareness about European Union is sometimes quite low, and so we first of all we try to always specify and say European Union rather than maybe EU. We talk about our 27 member states and the 27 we have represented here in South Africa, and then a reflection that it's maybe more around South Africa is that it's also, sometimes there is this idea of Europe, and listening to the discussion before, and sort of the first point of entry is colonialism, and of course for many member states that is quite a difficult topic, because many member states would not identify as having been colonizers in Africa or elsewhere. But yes, there are some where there is that history. But often I find the challenge is a bit that the negative gets put on the entire union, whereas a positive sort of often gets to stay bilateral, if you know what I mean. And I can see that just in South Africa, given the history of my country, Sweden, that if I present as a Swedish person, I would get a different sort of reception as opposed to presenting as European Union. So I think that is something we live through. But then in terms of being associated with other sort of European countries that are not part of the Union, well, of course, a lot of them are also, have expressed their desire to join the Union, and we have very close relationships with them, both in Europe and here. And then, we are happy to collaborate both in Europe and in third countries where we are present through EU delegations or missions, and Ukraine being an example, where we've had a lot of collaboration with the embassy here in South Africa, even though they're not part of the European Union yet. But we've invited them into the European family and for events on many occasions.
That's an interesting aspect that also resonates with something I've seen recently when in Addis Ababa and engaging with the Ukrainian embassy there, who's struggling very much to find a seat at the table, even if they're accredited at the African Union. So to sort of get their narrative across. So what concretely is like? Do you see yourself more as a door opener because the EU is more likely to have a seat at the table in diplomatic contexts, or is there even an alignment in the different the European and Ukrainian African policies, so in terms of objectives? So is it more the practicalities, or is there also a sort of a European foreign policy beyond the EU that would be in the making?
Well, that's a big question that I'm not sure I'm the one to answer. But in terms of practically, I think as EU we often talk about our convening power. One that we can sort of convene all the member states and support an embassy like the embassy of Ukraine here by without them having to knock on the doors of 22 embassies. They can knock on our door and we can convene the others, and we can have engagements like that, and we do that regularly. And then we've also last year for the European Film Festival, we had, and the year before that actually also, we had Ukraine participate. Georgia participated for the first time last year also. So those are some, and after the Russian invasion of Ukraine also, when we celebrated Europe Day on 9 May last year, we had the Ukrainian ambassador there, and we had a sort of Ukrainian theme to that reception, and so those are some practical sort of measures in terms of liaising with Ukraine and other non-EU European countries here. But in terms of broader, we, as you know, Ukraine also has an aspiration of joining the European Union. So I wouldn't say we're in the midst of shaping something broader. We can only speak for our 27 member states.
And I wanted to pick on the element you introduced in the beginning, so that there's an aspiration to be a global actor, which is generally recognized, and now from my experience and probably yours as well, having worked at the UN before, for instance in Brussels, all the UN agencies have formed an Africa task force, which is one of the main points of discussions with the European External Action Service. So where it is about, well, what can the EU and the UN do together in Africa? And so often when the UN approaches as a European Union, it is about how to do things outside of Europe rather than in Europe, whereas there's sometimes a sentiment of, well, when it's about issues that are intra-European, whether it's Kosovo, even Cyprus, even though there's a UN peacekeeping mission in Cyprus, but even Cyprus or the Caucasus, conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, of course the war in Ukraine, that there is less predisposition to sort of have multilateral solutions to conflicts and conflict prevention in Europe, as there is more disposition to do so abroad. So from you having been on both sides, UN on EU, would you see that there is this preference for acting multilaterally outside, but when it's a European matter, then there's sort of a prerogative for the EU to act on its own?
I see what you mean, but I think as for African Union, or you have sort of the principle of subsidiarity and trying to solve issues first through the closest regional body. So I guess that principle sort of applies, to Europe as well as to here. But then I don't think it's necessarily true that when we look at sort of collaboration or AU, UN, and we are a lot trying to push for AU, UN, EU collaboration, because we see a lot of benefits from these three bodies coming together. But that is really around principles and norms, and the functioning of the multilateral system, which will apply to all. But then I think from sort of the little time I've spent working for the European Union, but also my understanding of bilateral relations, I think you can witness a shift in practical examples, like we have this political and security dialogue forum as the EU together with South Africa, and I think in the past the tendency would be a lot to then discuss, peace and security issues in Africa. But in the recent meetings that we've also had a lot of agenda items that relate to the European continent, so that it really, moving to a true partnership where we exchange on issues of mutual concern, but it's not just sitting together to talk about issues in Africa, but sitting together and talking about, issues on our side of the world and here. And I think that is, a very important shift, and something that we should probably, take even further, or there's more to be done in terms of ensuring that it's really an equal partnership.
And are there particular areas, whether it's thematic areas or particular formats, where you see this could actually work, this reciprocity, that it's not just, we get together to find solutions on the African side, but we also is there some sort of some learning effect on knowledge from Africa, for instance, on how regional integration works in Africa, where there's maybe a source of inspiration for the EU. Do you see any specific sectors or themes where this could work?
I think there are several, and you know, we do discuss a lot of those common themes when it comes to South Africa that I focus on. Of course, it's, you know, we're very aligned in terms of principles and norms around human rights, gender equality, you know, discussing peace and security, architecture. The multilateralism and the defense of multilateralism and a rules-based world order. So I think, you know, there's a lot in terms of themes, and then of course sort of all the issues of the future and where we have strong partnerships in place already now. I mean, one sort of top of mind, of course, now for us is both in terms of pandemic recovery and preparing for, you know, the next pandemic, and where we've invested a lot as European Union into strengthening also vaccine manufacturing here in Africa for the African continent. But you know, where there's also great recognition of the very good sort of you know, hub that South Africa is in particular, but also the continent in terms of scientists and that have actually been part of sequencing and identifying some of these variants and laying the ground for effective vaccine development. And then climate change, of course, where I think, you know, there's both a lot that European Union can do in terms of supporting the continent, but also in terms of learning and digitization being another one where I think also, you know, youth and sort of the innovation is a source of inspiration also in Africa, and that, you know, more and more we will depend on the young population of Africa with our growing population in Europe.
On the issue of engagement with the world, I mean, there's been a sort of a tendency over time that there will be more engagement, and there has been steadily more engagement and opening more and more delegations and committing more resources. But at the same time, over the last 2 years, there's been also a debate about what I would call disengagement in a way, or more of a strategic approach to how do you prioritize. More talk about what's been framed as strategic autonomy, so that the EU needs to ensure its own food security, its own energy security, etc., which to some degree requires a bit of decoupling from the world of disengagement, and it's been very clear with Russia, so sanctions, disengagement in commercial links. So how would you balance so that at one side there's a desire within the EU to become more autonomous to some degree, and at the same time continuing to play this role globally. So to where to put how does it affect in a way the priorities that you have to set?
I don't really see a contradiction there. It's true that we've had a sort of a lot of debate and a strong push around, you know, both how to assert ourselves more, you know, as a global power, but also to look at strategic autonomy and strengthening the union. But I would say a lot of the big sort of transformational initiatives that we have together with Africa are also about strengthening Africa's strategic autonomy, and I think in the end, it's in the European Union's interest to also have, because you are our closest neighbor and partner, so to see a strong, continent next to us, I think is also in our interest, and which is why we are also investing. And the most recent sort of initiative is the Global Gateways, where we have committed to an investment of 150 billion euros for Africa, looking at issues like digitization, fighting climate change and adapting to it, and education and infrastructure and health. So I can see that it might seem like a contradiction, but I wouldn't really agree.
Very well on this. In order to have this this dialogue or this partnership, there seems to be now a need for a change of narrative in a way. If you look at the disagreements that there have been over the war on Ukraine, and for instance the last Peace and Security Council meeting between the two unions, the African Union and the European Union, so where you have the top leaders responsible for security matters, ended without a common joint declaration, as it usually would be, and this is partly attributed to the fact that there is a difficulty to find a common narrative and to find a common ground, not only in Ukraine, but that this has then ramifications. As an observer, it seemed to me that this has been possibly an eye-opening experience also for the European side, that was maybe not expecting that much of a pushback. So it seems clear that neither side can take the other one for granted. So this might require then sort of a change of narrative, but which poses a very big problem if as you outlined, a value-based or norm-oriented actor. So can you sort of bracket certain things where there is no consensus, or where it's very difficult to find a consensus, and focus on these things that you mentioned, where there is potential, health, digitalization, etc. So is this? Do you see that this would be possible to sort of be more pragmatic, or is this is a principled notion, the value-based notion? Is this something that is sort of a red line, which needs to be cleared before a real partnership can start?
Well, it's now tomorrow, actually, on the day a year ago since we held our last EU, so European Union, African Union summit, where our leaders agreed that on a renewed partnership between the EU and the AU, and that it would be one of solidarity, security, peace, and sustainable and sustained economic development and prosperity, founded on joint values such as respect for sovereignty and mutual respect and accountability. And even though a lot has happened, since, many of the joint challenges that were identified in that communique, pandemic recovery, inequality that is growing, food security issues, climate change, all those joint challenges are still there, no, and have grown even bigger. And we see how Russia's war against Ukraine is affecting us all, and really is felt in people's daily lives. But especially here in Africa in terms of food security and energy prices. So I would say, the long-term possibilities that a strong partnership offers from our side remains steadfast. And we sometimes talk about being in a our High Representative Vice President has called it, a messy multipolarity, and some people talk about a global disorder. And it's true that these are extremely challenging times, but to us, even the more reason to strengthen the partnership. And as partners, you do not always agree. But you discuss and you keep sort of the doors of communication open. So I'm guessing your question is sort of referring a bit to different positions taken on Russia's war against Ukraine, but there's no sort of red line of pulling back from the very strong EU partnership that we have, and I think continued engagements show that. And in terms of South Africa, which is one of 10 strategic partners worldwide, we held a ministerial meeting here just last month, 26th to 27th of January, where our High Representative Vice President was here along with 3 EU commissioners, and where we discussed the very broad and dynamic partnership that we have, and how to take it forward into the future.
And then I wanted to come to what I found a very interesting development in diplomacy and diplomacy of the European Union is that it is not anymore, at least the monopoly of the diplomatic service, but you have other actors, and notably the European Parliament that is keen on developing its own parliamentary diplomacy, including opening offices and antennas in Africa and other continents, so that there is the aspiration of having sort of several actors represented here, which poses certain opportunities because they can parliamentarians can be much more vocal and direct. They have less diplomatic constraints in approaching certain issues. But at the same time, this can mean a lot of headache also for the diplomatic service of having then to sort of make sure that there's not incoherence in who is speaking on behalf of the EU, and making sure that there's sort of still one perception of one EU, but at the same time allow different institutions to voice their own positions, which might sometimes diverge. So how do you see this development, and how would you then practically manage that there is another actor that is coming in and is also speaking on behalf of the EU, but might have different positions on certain topics?
I think relations ultimately will always come down to people relations. No, it's about people having relations, and we like to talk about our very broad relations with Africa, be it in academia like today, or private sector and business, where the EU is South Africa's biggest trading partner and foreign direct investment, and also let me look at my sheet for the African continent, also, our trade with, we're the biggest trading partner and biggest foreign direct investor in Africa. And that, of course, comes back to people and businesses, etc. And I think, and then we have cultural relations. We have a lot of ties also with diaspora from Africa in Europe, and I don't think we need to control those people-to-people relations. They should flourish in their own right. Then does it sometimes pose a challenge to us as a mission, to sort of defend statements made by, an institution? Yes, of course, but I think that's no different than for any embassy that will have to sort of or find itself, questioned about the actions of an individual company originating from their country, or parliamentarians for that. So I think maybe the challenge we have is that it's a quite complex institution and multifaceted with different levels. And that, of course, we just have to try to do a better job of explaining. But I would like to sort of make a push for letting those people-to-people relations flourish, and we do a lot to enable that, both in terms of cultural programs, of course the Erasmus Plus programs that allow students and academics to go live in other countries, for countries here to go to Europe, and vice versa, and all the sort of positive things that come with those relations built down the line that will benefit both our continents.
Before opening the floor to questions, wanted to pose one question that is a bit more forward-looking, because there have been reflections about which route should EU engagement with the world take. We've had the conference on the future of Europe, so which has been a more deliberate, more deliberations with civil society as to how should EU in the world look like, among others. Then we have European elections coming up next year, so which will also probably generate a lot of debate. I still have I realized the pen from the European elections 2019, the gift that keeps on giving. So I hope it lasts until last year. But looking forward into that there is debate and rethinking about what should also change maybe or in our priorities in the way we insert ourselves into other regions of the world. So how would you see these debates to shape your own work, and by extension this also shapes in a way our work, because our research likes to follow things as they develop and contribute also to the better understanding. So all these things that are in the making, and where the path is not maybe fully set out yet, but so where do you see sort of the near future of European diplomacy? Are there things that are fundamentally put into questions, or priorities that are shifting, or just general way to conduct diplomacy that might possibly change in the next few years?
Easy question. Not sure how to answer that one, but I mean, yes, we as discussed earlier, there are a lot of deliberations going on, and of course, I mean our origin is being a massive sort of peace project following the end of the Second World War. And now we face the most hostile security environment since since then, and so there's a lot of I would say the biggest change perhaps is in terms of thinking around how to increase our capacity and strengthen our resilience and invest more in defense capabilities. And we last year formally approved what we call a strategic compass, which outlines a very ambitious plan of action for how to strengthen the EU security and defense policy by 2030. So that is probably the major shift in terms of diplomacy. But then I would say it's just also a much stronger resolve going back to the treaty and those core principles laid out. And I think something that preoccupies us a lot right now goes back to, you know, how we can intensify support for a rules-based world order with the United Nations at its core. So, you know, I would say that maybe going back to the value-based, you know, will be even stronger going forward.
Very well. Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. For